Hello, and welcome to One World, One Health, where we chat with people working to solve some of the biggest problems facing our world. I'm Maggie Fox. This podcast is brought to you by the One Health Trust, with bite-sized insights into ways to help address challenges such as infectious diseases, climate change, and pollution. A One Health approach recognizes that we're all connected: animals, plants and people, and the climate and environment. We're going to connect two problems in this episode: microplastics and antimicrobial resistance. This is not an intuitive link, and we'd like to explore how scientific research can help answer questions that people might not even have thought to ask. Microplastics are little pieces of plastic that are seemingly found everywhere, from the top of Mount Everest to deep inside our own bodies. Most of all, they float around in water, in oceans, lakes, and in water treatment discharges. They're formed when plastic objects break down, and it seems they can carry pollutants such as heavy metals and drug-resistant microbes. It's this last quality we're looking at in this episode. Neila Gross is studying for her PhD in material science engineering at Boston University. She and her colleagues found that drug-resistant microbes, sometimes called superbugs, can grow especially well on microplastics. Could that help these superbugs spread more widely? We're chatting with her today about what her team found. Neila, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you tell us first what even got you interested in doing this kind of study in the first place?
Yeah, so I work in a lab at Boston University who looks at drivers of antimicrobial resistance from the environment, and we do this through the lens of vulnerable people. And one of the aspects that we were interested in was waste disposal, and there's a huge topic coming up of microplastics, and so we were very interested in looking to see if there was a link there.
And what did you find in the study that you did?
So we first wanted to look at different characteristics of microplastics, right? There's different sizes and shapes and even between plastic composition. And what we found was when we exposed E. coli, which is a bacteria that's regularly found all over the world, and to these microplastics, they developed resistance through an increased minimum inhibitory concentration, right? So you give antibiotics to bacteria and they're supposed to kill them. And so depending on the concentration of antibiotic you give, if that concentration increases, then you're seeing resistance growth. So we saw that the amount of antibiotic we had to give to kill off the bacteria over the course of 10 days increased a lot. And this was regardless of the concentration or size of the microplastics that we tested.
Can you tell us a little bit about the microplastics that you did test? How big are they? Where did you get them?
Yeah, so we bought them from another lab who makes them, but microplastics are sort of, the definition is pretty vague. It's any plastic that's below 5 millimeters, which is, you can see, it's about the size of your pinky nail. And so we tested from 10 micrometers, which is very, very small, to about half a millimeter. And we looked at polystyrene, which are like your packing peanuts. We looked at polyethylene, which is like the plastic that you find on your normal water bottles, and polypropylene, which are the plastics that are found on like shipping crates.
So this is a lab you bought them from. Right? Did they collect these out of the environment? Do these kind of resemble real-life microplastics that might be around?
So the lab, they have to make them, but they make them out of samples that they get from industry. So it's pure polystyrene that they fabricate into smaller particles that are all the same size or all the same shape. We use spheres in this study, and so we needed to make sure that we could quality control. And so they're pure, like it was pure polystyrene or pure polyethylene.
And so what your study showed was that not only did the bacteria grow well when the microplastics were mixed with them, but they also developed this resistance to antibiotics more quickly.
Yeah, so it was really interesting to see just how quickly that they gained resistance and the fact that the bacteria were resistant to multiple antibiotics, or at least all of the antibiotics that we tested. We tested 4 different families of antibiotics. And so they not only were they very quick in gaining their resistance, but the resistance itself was very strong per se. And we looked at that through the lens of a clinical breakpoint, which is basically when you're using an antibiotic in the clinic in a human setting and the antibiotic is no longer useful past a certain concentration. So you go to a different family of antibiotic or you use a stronger antibiotic within the same family.
Okay, what might cause this phenomenon? What on earth is it about microplastics that would make the bacteria not only grow, but grow resistant to antibiotics?
That's a really good question. And what we found was that basically bacteria grow on the surface of the microplastic. And so they grow into what's called a biofilm. And I always like to relate a biofilm to a house. And so bacteria like build this house, basically, this biofilm, and it protects them from all sorts of things. Just like a house, it has protects them from weather or whatnot. And in this case, the biofilm protects the bacteria from antibiotics. And so when they grow this biofilm on the surface of the microplastics, they're able to resist pretty much any antibiotic that comes at them. But what we wanted to see is, is this the case for just microplastics or is it any surface, right, that's there? And so we included glass in our study, and there are lots of small glass particles from the makeup industry and textile industry, so we know that those are also in the environment. And what we found was when we looked at the surface of the glass compared to the microplastic, the glass had almost no growth on the surface. And it did have less of an ability to resist the antibiotics, so it wasn't resistant to multiple antibiotics.
So you found that this happened. Are you looking at what the mechanism might be? What is it that's different about microplastics that makes them more conducive to this?
Yeah, so microplastics or plastics just in general have like a lot of really interesting properties. I mean, they're super hydrophobic, which means they hate water. And so they sort of form this little tiny air pocket around them. But we are currently looking into mechanisms, but there has been some research that has shown that microplastics actually just absorb antibiotics. And so you can think of that as if the microplastics themselves are just taking the antibiotics out of the solution, right? And they're putting it into the center of the plastic themselves. And so that takes the antibiotics out of the equation. And so then it can't interact with the bacteria. But there's a lot of working theories right now that we're testing in the lab currently.
So this was a lab experiment. You weren't going out and finding microplastics that were in the ocean and testing them. You did it in the lab, and there's a reason for that.
Yes. So it was a lab experiment, and we did it in the lab first because we wanted a controlled environment. So we wanted to see if we control all of the variables like temperature and sun exposure and all of these things that could potentially make it different. We wanted to see just what the base interactions were. And then from there, once we understand what happens when just microplastics and just bacteria with all of these controlled settings, what happens there? And so now that we have that information, we can start to tune things to make it more real world like.
And are you going to do that?
Yes. So we have several field sites that we are going to start sampling from, and we plan on characterizing what we call the resistome. So the resistome includes antibiotic-resistant genes. It will include different minimum inhibitory concentrations, that MIC, to different antibiotics. We're interested in also characterizing any microbial communities we find on the surface of these microplastics.
So, what's the threat you see from these microplastics? How can these little bitty pieces of plastic, maybe carrying these drug resistant bacteria, be a threat to people?
I think it's multifold. Within the plastics themselves, of course, you have a worry for dissemination. So if you have antibiotic resistant bacteria that are upstream of a town or settlement or whatnot, microplastics have the ability to carry those bacteria faster and probably better than bacteria would be able to move on their own. So that's one concern within the ability of microplastics to disseminate resistant microbes. The other thing is we have a runway basically where we are running out of time as more resistant bacteria start popping up, and our pipeline for antibiotics is not keeping up with the rate at which those bacteria are becoming resistant. And so identifying key drivers like microplastics, for instance, of antimicrobial resistance might allow us to extend that runway that we have to find more novel antibiotics or different solutions to antimicrobial resistance, because that allows us to plan and potentially create some mitigation strategies.
Is there any evidence out there now that microplastics are actually spreading drug-resistant bacteria?
There are some correlation. I wouldn't say that there's any causation studies that have been found, but we do know there was a recent study that was just published that found within soil samples, microplastics increase the rate of horizontal gene transfer, which is just the bacteria's ability to give genes to other bacteria, and those might be resistant genes and whatnot.
That's an interesting quality of bacteria, right? They can swap these whole cassettes of drug-resistant genes with one another. They can just like show up and it's like, here, have some drugs. You know, it's the equivalent, right, of somebody dealing drugs. They can just spread this resistance to other bacteria.
Yeah, no, it is. And I think in biofilms, particularly, you see a huge increase in that rate of swapping. And so, if you find that microplastics are increasing biofilm formation, then you know that not only does that provide sort of like an armor for bacteria, but it also allows bacteria to talk to each other a lot easier. And so that rate of horizontal gene transfer increases, hundreds of fold.
If there's a piece of plastic and it's got this biofilm growing on it, what's the likelihood that these bacteria will get out or their genes will get out or their resistance will get out? Because as you said, it's like having a little house and they're hiding in this little mat that they have built. So are they actually very secure on these microplastics and perhaps not a danger?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it's a really unique feature about biofilms. So biofilms have a lifespan where they're grown and then they're sort of kept by the bacteria that are living inside them. And so those bacteria use the biofilm and sort of do upkeep on it. But then after a certain number of days, the biofilm will disperse. And so it'll actually kick out a lot of the bacteria that are living in there, which is, as you can imagine, a problem because if you have all of these bacteria that are inside swapping genes and becoming more resistant, and then the biofilm releases them into the environment, it's basically just another mode for them to gain more resistance.
Neila, your lab also focuses on vulnerable people. Was there a specific link there that you were looking at when you were looking at microplastics?
So the research that's come out that showed the plastic load that we have within our bodies, those are all done on, US people or people from Europe. You can imagine for someone who lives in a place that doesn't have waste disposal. So imagine just living around your own trash. Or a lot of people in low income countries burn their trash. And so imagine sitting next to a fire where you're burning all of the plastics, and plastic does not go away, right? It just goes into smaller pieces. And so you're inhaling all of that. And so you can imagine that the plastic load that we have that's come out in recent studies is probably, I don't know, a tenth of what the plastic load that these people who don't have adequate waste disposal. And that's just a random guess. I mean, I'm sure it probably is more considering how ubiquitous these plastics are everywhere. And I have lived in several countries in East Africa, and I can say one of the ways in which we got rid of our trash was just to burn it.
So, what can anybody right now do about this potential problem?
There definitely are ways in which you can lower your plastic use. Lots of people have been, deplasticizing their houses. And I think that's one way, decreasing plastic use is good for the environment, definitely, and would potentially help what's going on here. I also think, just following good antibiotic stewardship, taking your antibiotics through the course and, not throwing out your antibiotics and whatnot into the environment. I think those are very good things that you could do to sort of slow down this problem and for each of us to do our own parts.
Neila, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking with us.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed our talk.
Listeners, if you enjoyed this podcast, please share it. You can find links to this and other important topics at onehealthtrust.org. And let us know what else you'd like to hear about at OWOH@onehealthtrust.org. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to One World, One Health, brought to you by the One Health Trust. I'm Ramanan Lakshminarayan, founder and president of the One Health Trust. You can subscribe to One World, One Health on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow us on social media at One Health Trust, one word, for updates on One World, One Health and the latest in research on One Health issues like drug resistance, disease spillovers, and the social determinants of health. Finally, please do consider donating to the One Health Trust to support this podcast and other initiatives and research that help us promote health and well-being worldwide. Until next time.